It's time for the biggest non-league football debate in the country. Search official BOTN and get involved with tonight's show.
So very good evening and welcome to the non-league debate. I'm delighted to say that Charlotte Richardson, Frank Wilson, Jim Cooper and Jody Brown join us this evening. We're talking all about player and management recruitment across non-league, and we're going to jump straight in and look at what recruitment is like across non-league and how does it happen, Jim?
Well, for instance, when I was manager down at Met, it was quite a basic one. It was done via players knowing other players, what I wanted to bring in, who I knew, how I could get to know the players. And it was basically as simple as that. And then it was a case of selling the club, your ambitions, and telling the players what they wanted to hear, if I'm being brutally honest. But without, in my instance, without telling any lies, being straightforward and being objective as to what my achievements, my aims were.
Frank, at the Premier League level, we hear so much nowadays about how many people are actually involved in player recruitment behind the scenes. At non-league level, is it a simple case of you pick up the phone, you talk to the player and you tell the club that you want him? Or are there other hoops that you need to go through?
Yeah, I think it's different at the level that we're discussing, non-league level. I think that obviously the leagues themselves have stipulations in place in terms of how you can approach players and, you know, what sort of, you know, what should we say, legal football routes you need to sort of take in order to speak to players. Similar to what Jim said, sort of in the off-season and periods where you were entitled to have conversations quite freely with people, it was more a case of trying to use your club's own internal resources to try and attract players and branch out.
Is that, Charlotte, you've worked at a football club in the Football League, you've worked in non-league as well. Behind the scenes, are there a lot of difference when it comes to player recruitment? Does a lot of it happen quietly, much more quietly than in the Football League?
Yeah, potentially. I think the experience is pretty similar. It's often a manic couple of weeks where you'll get a little bit of an ushering of getting ready to announce a player. You also get those ones where you've prepared a statement and all of a sudden you're pulling it because that player might have changed their mind or some other circumstances have gone in place. But in my role within kind of marketing and comms, it's trying to generate those signings to get a bit of a buzz, which will then impact upon season ticket sales and stuff like that. But I think for every manager, it's a really hectic period, constantly on the phone, and it's kind of my job in the comms part to supplement it so it has as big a positive impact as possible.
And Jody, for that manager's view, the sort of signing on side of it, the wages, the negotiations, everything else, Jim mentioned about setting out that desire to want to get involved in what the club's trying to achieve, what the manager's trying to achieve. Do you get involved personally as a manager in those wage negotiations?
Yeah, I think always in non-league football. I've never heard of it where the manager doesn't get involved in the wage negotiating. Normally the managers are in charge of controlling the budget. So, yeah, you're always looking to get value for money. But there's lots of competition. It's a bit of a free-for-all, really, in non-league football. It's a bit of a free-for-all. Makes it very difficult for managers.
So we know almost now what's involved. But I guess the biggest thing in non-league is the scouting side of it. You have vast networks in the Football League, but we'll come on to management a little bit later and how perhaps managers are selected because of their knowledge in the game. But the scouting side of it, is that just down to experience?
Well, yes and no. I mean, it's a case of using your experience to utilise all the options that are open to you. For instance, in my opinion, sadly, agents are coming more and more into non-league football, and they can act though as part of a scouting network for you. You know, they're making contact with you and recommending players, asking what particular positions you're actually looking for, and then they'll come back to you and say to you, listen, I've got that player for you to go and have a look at. So, you know, if you want to utilise, as I say, a negative side of the non-league, then great. But ultimately, it's down to being a good manager and building contacts and asking other people to actually go out and look at players on your behalf.
Do all clubs have a similar scouting network, let's say at step 3 and above, or would it really depend club to club?
I think it would largely depend on budget. I think that the more resources that you have as a club, then the more ability you have to employ or instruct players or personnel to go out and look for players on the club's behalf, as Jim alluded to there. I think importantly, as to what Jim said as well, I think that we're seeing more and more sort of intermediates, people that are representative of players, whether they're official agents or they are sort of liaisons or have relationships with players, particularly in the sort of inner circle of non-league football. I know I come across quite a few examples in the last 2 seasons being at Tooting of particular people that represented players at non-league level only, and they would nominate players to you in pre-season or throughout the season and sort of, you know, discuss them with you and what they would like them to do.
Is it more something that you might have somebody that you know? We mentioned last week actually on the debate about how for the younger players and recruiting younger players and coaching younger players, Jody, you said that you did it yourself, and I think Jim, you were saying that you bring somebody in perhaps that would concentrate on that area. Is it similar for scouting then, as far as someone you trust the opinions of?
Scouting's twofold, isn't it? It's one, it's looking for potential players that you want to bring in. Also, it's scouting the opposition. I found that I would want to scout the opposition myself, so that I could prepare my team the way I wanted to, based on what I saw. But in terms of scouting players, I think you take a lot of recommendations and then you follow it up. Like Jim said, players will obviously say, "Oh, my friend is playing at such and such. Would you be interested?" But a big opportunity of scouting, certainly when you're doing well in a division, is when you play teams below you. You know, last year we took Matt Price from Brentwood, who were in the bottom 3, bottom 4. We were a good, easy sell. We were towards the top of the division. He came in. He ended up league's top goal scorer. We did the same with Ahmed Abdullah. He was a really, really good centre midfielder playing at Ware, who were struggling as well. So I think when you come up against opponents, you're actually paying attention to their players as well. That's a great scouting tool.
Very famously at the moment in the press is this debate at Manchester United, where does Mourinho actually get the players that he wants? Is it the club that are looking at the players? They're looking to bring, I think, a director of football in. They're one of the clubs that haven't got them. Is it in clubs where it will just be at this level, it is solely down to the manager? There isn't perhaps chairman out there or maybe people behind the scenes that are saying, we want to bring in this type of player?
I'm sure there probably are a few clubs where the board might have their say and influence, but it was something I was considering on the drive here. What does make a good non-league football manager? And I think that network and that book of contacts is massive. I mean, at Margate, for example, when Steve Watt was appointed, you know, a very well-respected, very good coach who could call upon players that he'd played with to come and join the Margate team, and that kind of influence brought us in some fantastic names, the likes of Alex Flisher dropping down from Maidstone to come and join Margate. And I think Mike and Steve are the same in terms of their networks and their connections, but ultimately I think football decisions need to be made by those in charge. But I know, and I'm pretty certain, there are a fair few football clubs out there where people perhaps not on the sidelines have a lot of influence and sway on who gets selected and signed. Is
that something that anyone else has experienced, where you perhaps as a manager have pressure to either play a certain player or recruit a certain player?
We had a small example of that last year at Tooting, where we were, sort of, to be politically correct, we were influenced by the team and the selection choices that we had to make in the London Cup. And it was disappointing from my personal perspective, because the London Cup was a competition that the club held in quite high regard. We'd won it the previous season. And we got through to the semi-final, and then it was communicated to me at the time that we had to play certain players, and we had to give some of the youth team players a chance for exposure and other reasons, and it impacted us because inevitably we lost that game and we could have got through to a cup final, and then you get the backlash of supporters sort of querying and questioning you as the man in charge to say, well, we had an opportunity to get to a final, but we changed the team at the last minute. That was just one example of sort of some influence in terms of the team selection side of things and how much sort of autonomy you had over a certain game or a competition.
It was quite interesting that you use a particular example of cup competitions from last season, because fortunately we've got somebody who's involved in a hell of a lot of games and cup competitions. Did you ever have any outside influences at Haybridge that said, actually, this needs to be a priority, or was that just something that came from you anyway?
No, they left me in complete control. So I've never experienced it at Haybridge, but other clubs I've been at, we've had chairmen and owners that try and influence your signings and your team selections, but I've been one who's always fought against that. So either it stops or I go. That's basically how it's been.
Perhaps the deciding vote can come from you, Jim. Have you ever had anybody try and tell you which players to recruit and get into your team, or perhaps even had somebody that's involved in the club that says, you know, we need a certain defender or certain striker? Does that happen in non-league?
It does happen in non-league. It happens quite often. Charlotte was very eloquently put across that she knows some chairman that would want to pick the team. I certainly know of quite a few chairmen in the Bostik Premier who would, or who does have quite a lot of input in the team selection. Personally, myself, no, it's never happened to me. However, I would always take on board what the chairman says, and then again, in a roundabout way, turn it on its head and say no.
Is that a result of what we're seeing at the very top of the game, filtering down to non-league, which is people that have money now, and you look at the likes of Salford and Billericay as that prime example in non-league. There are more clubs that perhaps they haven't got the same amount of money as those two clubs have, but they're still investing in the club. And when you now allow people to invest into the club like that, does that mean they have the right to have a say? Is that why we're seeing it more in non-league?
I think you get it when you've got a big investor, an individual. The clubs when I've had it, it's been because there's been one investor, so they're far more passionate about who you pick and who you don't pick, and the style of football and your recruitment. Whereas when you're at a club that's managed by a committee and self-sufficient and not reliant on one man's choices, then you tend to be given the freedom to manage the football club.
If we put it another way, if any of you had money and invested and bought a football club at this level, would you be able to let the manager just get on with it, or would you think you'd sort of say, look, I think we need this player in the team because I've seen him last week and he scored a few goals?
It's a difficult question to answer, Ben. I mean, we had a conversation similar to this off air tonight about the different types of chairmen that you get and that you come across and that you work for, or that you hear about, and whether or not they are sort of football minded or football orientated, and specifically non-league football. I'm sure if you were in that position of power, it would be, if you're a passionate football person, it would probably be difficult for you to detach yourself completely from the sort of the run-ins of the first team or the run-ins of the football club. But I think that good chairmen have a balance, don't they? Good chairmen understand the man that's in charge, and they know how to work with them, and if they feel like they need to lend a hand or assist in certain ways, and they will, or if they have confidence that that person will do it, their responsibility, then that's what differentiates a good chairman from a not so good one.
I know that we're specifically talking about player recruitment, but I'm sure actually from a chairman's side of things that perhaps has some money, it's maybe more the tactical approach in the game that might be questioned rather than the recruitment. One of the things I do want to ask is, if you're a player that's playing perhaps let's say steps 5 to 9, what are your chances of being recruited by a team in the National League at steps 2 and 3 and into the Bostik divisions? Do we have capabilities now with scouts going down as far as step 5, or is it really down to you're going to be scoring 40-50 goals a season to get noticed?
I think a lot of the scouting is just lazy. People read the non-league paper, see who's scoring goals. People go on Twitter, see which players are tweeting about their goals, and a lot of word of mouth. I'll be truthful, I don't think many National League sides are watching step 5 to step 9. I think probably the lowest they go is step 4. You might have the odd club that is going down and looking at the county leagues and stuff, but I think again more of it's just word of mouth. Someone will ring them up and say, oh, there's this boy who's got 35 goals in the Kent County League, and then they'll go and have a look. But normally I think they wait for them to get into sort of step 3, succeed, and then that's when the National League sides start coming in for them.
We know that budgets are quite tight in non-league clubs, so it's not as easy as just sending scouts to all these different games. But is the way that scouting's done at the moment, is it the best way, or should there be clubs that are perhaps thinking a little bit more outside the box to try and bring in players younger? We talked last week about the importance of academies and recruiting younger players, but from a scouting point of view, even perhaps when they're 17, 18 at these lower levels, it'd be a good time to bring them in.
Yeah, I mean, excuse me if I get the player's name wrong, but a great example of some good scouting comes from Dagenham and Redbridge Football Club, where Paul Benson was playing for a team out in Southend that was playing way below, I think it was, even Essex Senior League, and he scored so many goals for Dagenham and Redbridge during his career, and he was scouted by Dagenham and Redbridge because that club is a club that needs to go and find the the diamond in the rough and actually get that sort of that player from obscurity and bring him into a top level football. The interesting point for me around that scouting, and Jody, you'll be able to pick on this, I'm sure, more, is the way Haybridge looked at the Spanish acquisitions you got down the club. And again, that's another innovative idea, inviting people over from Spain to troll for your football club.
And I guess when we're talking about scouting, one of the interesting things, obviously, Charlotte, you work in it at Margate, and you touched on the manager last year and bringing in the new team of managers. Does that automatically mean when you change manager that you're going to be in for a busy summer as a club, because they're going to want to bring in a lot more of their own players? Would it have been more of a smooth transition if Steve would have stayed into this season?
Yeah, potentially. I think at Margate, certainly when I joined, I knew that there had been a bit of a tumultuous history with the football club. Obviously, it had that awful season of relegation, and Steve was brought in to stabilise the club, and that's been very much the ambitions on and off the pitch. So I think part of the reason why Steve and Mike were appointed was to continue that stability, and their first three signings were James Rogers, Liam Friend and Tom Winter, to try and keep that stability there. But it's hard. It's a challenge sometimes to kind of keep those players. I would certainly say at Margate we have a handful that could be competing a league higher, and then on the flip side, the team have had to invest in a lot of young players this year, so like Chris Barnard, Jack Paxman, very, very talented young players who are going to make mistakes and errors now and then, but they're kind of earning their stripes right now. And I think that's potentially why there's been a lack of consistency to our start of the season. It's that blend of experience and youth. And when we were talking about, I think we were brushing on a really interesting topic in terms of investors in non-league football. And I think this season, I don't know why, at every level of the game, the scrutiny that managers are under now is unbelievable, to the point where I had to kind of take a step back myself this week and think we're 10 games into the season and there are managers that are coming under such scrutiny. Some, we've seen quite a lot of high-profile sackings already because there is that level of scrutiny, there's that level of exposure, and people want results quickly, and if they're putting money in, they want those results even faster. So I'm not sure I'd ever want to be a football manager, but I think it's an interesting time and it's a challenging time when you have potentially got that board asking questions and wanting those results.
We'll definitely talk more about manager recruitment later, and certainly a really good point there that managers are under a lot of pressure, as I'm sure these guys around the table will vouch for. One of the things that we just touched on there, Frank, was that the fact that actually recruitment not only is recruiting perhaps players from outside the club, but within the club, and that turnaround periods where managers go. And last season we've seen a change obviously in manager at your club when you left Tooting. They appointed I'm going to try and get this right, the youth team managers, the younger managers, 21 managers that came in to become the managers. Yeah. When that happens in a club, is there an eye there on this is going to save us some money for recruitment, or this is going to be easier because they know the younger players?
I guess in my position it would be difficult for me to tap into the club's thinking precisely in terms of what they were going for. I think from an outsider's point of view looking in, I think it would appear that way in terms of maybe just the sort of the club's approach. I think they made it quite clear that they wanted to try and invest more in the youth team structure, and they wanted to try and steer the club in an onward or in a forward direction of trying to bring through more examples of young players becoming first team regulars, and we had quite a lot of it in my time during there as manager, but I think that the club are probably looking to see more and more of that, and that might well be for budget reasons. That might well be because they're looking to save money on the recruitment of players externally from other clubs, because nowadays it's not cheap to sign good players. We all know that as managers, and a cost-effective way of doing that is by bringing through your own homegrown academy players. And think we were fortunate enough at Tooting to have an academy to start with, to have a resource where you can actually bring these players through. So a possible angle for the chairman or the club in terms of making that appointment this year.
Yeah, so down the Met, obviously I resigned in the summer, and Gavin, who's been my assistant for the past 15 years, has stepped up and he's now the first team manager. So in that instance, it's been a good thing for the Met Police to have that consistency. Gav knows the clubs, knows the players, and as a result of that, I think that the club are doing well and they're playing a lot of the youngsters in the first team. Now, if someone else would have come in who didn't know the club, the way the club works, the way the setup is, I think that would have been a lot more difficult for somebody to have taken over from me in that aspect.
One of the things that I really wanted to talk about when we were talking about player recruitment is this phrase of tapping up, which we've heard a lot of in. I think Virgil van Dijk was one of the big cases where there was actually an admission made from, I think it was Liverpool, that said, we shouldn't have actually talked to him at that point. You hear from managers that come on, we did the show all of last year and heard a lot of things, a lot of stories, that it does exist in non-league football as well. And is enough done to, well, first of all, does it happen and is it prevalent in the non-league game? And secondly, is there enough done to stop that? Or is there anything that we can do to stop that happening?
First of all, I'm not sure there is anything you can do to stop it. It's just one word against another. So if I speak to a player and that player doesn't tell anyone, then you'll never know that I've tapped him up. I think every manager taps players up in non-league football. I think it's rare that anyone will put a 7-day approach into a player that they haven't got an inkling that player might be interested in coming. Obviously, it's one of those things that people have to publicly deny, but the truth is it's prevalent. It goes on all the time. The day I walked out from Haybridge, I think about 8 of the Haybridge players were forwarding me messages that they received from other clubs' managers showing interest in them. And I said to all of the players, I said, yeah, it looks potentially a good move for you, but I would have hoped you'd start Haybridge. But first and foremost, tell that club to just put a 7-day approach in. Just be respectful of the other club. But we all do it. So we all tap players up. There's no point denying it. I don't think these guys can truly deny it. Maybe you can. Maybe you're better than me. But I think every manager, you have some sort of contact with a player before you make the approach. It's very different when there's contracts involved, because then you go through the club. But generally in non-league football, at step 3 and step 4, there's not that many contracted players.
I should have phrased that question another way. Does anybody do it properly?
You probably met with silence, Ben. Right, so there are things in place. There's the 7-day approach. So if it's a non-contracted player, the club who want to sign the player should be putting in a 7-day approach to that club and then officially waiting until the 7 days before they speak to the player. Or if it's a contracted player, then they go into negotiations with the other club. But let's get this right. So when I was a manager, very, very rarely did I actually tap the player up beforehand. However, my players will know that player, and I will be speaking to my player, who I know will then be speaking to the player I'm interested in signing. So it's a case of, of course, I'm not speaking to him directly, but I know for a fact that I will have a yes or no he's interested in speaking to me via a route, via the players. And whether that's right or wrong, everyone does it. It's as simple as that. The only thing different to that is that when a 7-day approach either came into my club for my players, I'd always waive the 7 days because I know they've been spoken to. So what's the point in waiting 7 days? If they want to go, they can go straight away. So, it swings and roundabouts really in relation to that. But yeah,
I think the 7-day rule is a bit prehistoric, to be honest. Just put a transfer window in place or something like that, because with non-contract and freedom of movement, what is the 7-day approach? Like what does it achieve, the 7-day approach? Like Jim says, if the player wants to go, you're best off just to waive the approach and let him go. You don't want him in your team on Tuesday night, do you, when he's already agreed terms somewhere else?
No, you're right, Jody, and if anything, it causes problems. It causes disruptions in your own environment, because the minute an approach comes in for your player, you know full well, as we've just alluded to there, that some form of communication has taken place with someone somewhere. And normally the best sort of route out of that situation is to have that immediate conversation with the player to say, look, the approach has come in, you've been aware or you haven't been aware, and then to deal with it as quickly as possible, because the longer it festers, then it runs a risk of then sort of, you know, breeding itself into the dressing room and into other players, and then before you know it, you've got sort of internal unrest. So
I don't want to. Sorry, Charles, I don't want to. You know, say answer for these two guys here, but do you know what? It was a case of just a little bit of respect. So you know they've spoken to your player. All I would be expecting is a phone call from that manager to say, listen, I've stuck a 7-day in for Joe Bloggs or whatever, just to let you know, a good player, I want him. You know, simple as that. But I know obviously then that he's spoken to him, and that's why I'm saying I will waiver the 7 days. It's just a little bit of respect amongst managers to pick the phone up and say, listen, I'm going to stick the 7-day in for so and so. I want to sign him, and that really just alleviates any unrest or bit of disrespect towards each other. But
you earn that through the managers, though, Jim, don't you?
You
build
do.
a rapport with another gaffer, and then the league probably don't want to hear it, but you then not bypass the law, but you know, if I'm obviously in communication with you, I would say, look, I'm interested in this player. Ryan James, for example, was a player that came to us from the Met, and I just phoned you up knowing you and just said, look, we're interested. Do you have to put a 7-day approach in? Well, no, we're letting him go. We've had a conversation with him. It's mutually released, blah blah blah, and then you sort of bypass that system. But I agree with you, Jody. I think that it's probably a method that would be better served not being sort of included in the system at all.
It's like another layer of administration, and I think the point you made about the mutual respect between managers, that's my experience having done a bit of club secretary duties last year for Margate. I can remember we were signing a midfielder, and I was speaking with the club secretary, pretty much got it all the way over the line, and then their manager said, well, we don't want him to play against us on whatever the date was. And I said, well, I can't make that decision, I can't speak on behalf. So I then had to ring our manager up, and oh goodness, like the phone driving to the game, back and forth, and in the end it took Steve to speak to their manager, and that was the way it was done. The club secretary and I were practically helpless in that situation, but we were both managed by this concept of the 7-day request and doing things in the right protocol, but also making sure it got in before a deadline. I think another point to make as well, from my experience having started within the women's game and player transfers and stuff like that, in the women's game the players go where the manager goes. There's a great deal of, if they want to play for the manager, that's where they're going no matter what the level is. In non-league, my perception so far is it's the network and how influential your group of players are in terms of bringing people and the messages they're putting out there about how much they're enjoying playing for their club and so on. So I think that's the distinction I would say that I've seen between, and then obviously the professional game, it's just a completely different ball game, the structures, and I think the implications if you were to go beyond the right boundaries are a lot heavier, but it is an interesting difference for sure.
I will go against what Jody said though, and you, Frank, and I'm going to say that there has to be something in place, because you can put a 7-day into one club, which then means you can't put another one into that same club for 28 days. So, for instance, last year, I think it was when James left Brightlingsea to go to Aveley, I think there was a mass exodus of Brightlingsea players that ended up going to Aveley. And again, that's because I think the mutual respect between the manager and the club, etc. But I do think there needs to be some safeguards in place.
I agree. I was just going to say that the one thing the 7-day rule does achieve is it stops mass exoduses. So, for example, if I was to take another job next week and wanted 5 of my Haybridge players, I wouldn't be able to do it because of that element of the 7-day rule. I just think it would be a greater test of managers and coaches if there was a transfer window, even down to our level, rather than this constant rotating door of players. You lose 2 games, you sign 6 new players. I think it's just a shortcut. I don't really like it. I've never really liked it, and I don't think the 7-day rule does a great deal to stop it. Because let's be honest, a non-contract player, if he gets unsettled, you're going to let him go anyway, aren't you? Regardless of whether that club's already put one 7-day into you, so you've got to wait 28 days. But this boy's saying to you, I'm going to go in 28 days anyway. I want to go. You're just going to let him go. The sensible thing is to let him go. So that's probably what happened at Aveley, between Aveley and Brightlingsea. I think it achieves very little.
We're going to talk about transfer window and a possible how that might work in non-league. It's come up a few times. I think it did on the show last year as well. But I really want to go back to that point that you just made, Charlotte, about networking amongst players. We'll talk again later on about managers and how perhaps it's important that they can network and the players that they know when it comes to recruiting a manager. But that point of players actually being on social media, being in amongst their group of friends that they know that might be playing somewhere else, Have you actually found that, and I put this out to you guys who have managed last season, did you find that was a really big thing and helped you, or you had to be perhaps aware of as well, of players leaving the club?
Yeah, definitely. Jim's made that point tonight quite strongly in terms of utilising players' relationships with other players. I think that Charlotte's point about social media and the powers of mediums like Twitter and how engaging they are, not just from player to player, but with clubs and fans as well. You get an enormous amount of supporters on social media now, on Twitter, following their favourite non-league players from their clubs, and managers as well, and in terms of trying to get yourself recruitment at other clubs in terms of roles.
Do you think about that when you're recruiting? So would it be something that you would think, well, this player, massive on social media, massive following, or perhaps this player knows these groups of players, is very influential? We talk about leaders in the dressing room, but perhaps leaders that can bring a network and bring you a couple of other players that you want in different positions. Is that something that would go on as a manager in your thought processes?
Yeah, definitely does. Obviously, the Haybridge journey, I went in when we were bottom of the league. We stayed up on the last day, and then there was this miraculous turnaround. I would never say it was solely down to me. Exactly what you've just said played a big part. We signed one senior player. I'm not going to mention the names of them because it might offend their previous clubs, but we signed one senior player, and he helped attract another 3 good players that he'd played with at another club, and it strengthened us overnight. It made a big difference to us. So in terms of senior players, people who are popular, leaders, good footballers, they've got a circle of friends, and they will help you bring the players in. Obviously, you still have to close the deal as a manager. You still need to sell your philosophy, your methods, your principles, and your ambition. But I think players help a great deal.
Working it the other way, then, in a dressing room, are there players that you would be worried that would be tapped up, or people put a 7-dayer in because you think, well, if I lose him, even if it's not right now, I might lose these couple of other players as well?
Yeah, there's always going to be some players in that dressing room. However, to not put a finer point on it, there's some really loyal players as well. And I'm going to name like Will Salmon, for instance. In my opinion, one of the best defenders, certainly at Bostik Premier in the league, has been for the past 5-6 years. Made the league team. It seemed that there was a 7-day for Will Salmon coming in, week out, and we had an agreement that he would only leave the club for a team that was playing in a higher level. He wouldn't even entertain how much money was thrown at him from another Bostik Premier side, or Ryman at the time. So it's a little bit of both. Yeah, there are some players that that would leave for another tenner. So you think you want to keep them, but another tenner, I've been offered that, so I'm going. And yet there are some really loyal players out there who ultimately you can rely on to remain in the club.
I probably, as well, in the same breath of talking about the powers and influences of social media, I would say from my personal experience, I would opt to maybe steer clear of players that were displaying or publicising themselves on the likes of Twitter and things, because I just think that whilst it's a powerful tool, also from a management perspective and from a recruitment perspective, they aren't, for me, necessarily the types of players that I would want to bring in, because you see it all the time now, even in professional football, how players will resort to Twitter and Instagram the minute the 90-minute whistle, 90 minutes is up, in terms of how well they played that day, but the team got beat, things like that. And I just think that there is perhaps a connotation involved with social media that represents players in a negative way, and they might not be the best. That might not be the best tool to recruit players specifically.
The only problem is you're not going to get away from it now.
No.
It's just getting more and more prevalent. Every player's on it. Every player's got an opinion. And I think unless, as managers, we'll move with the times and just accept they're going to spout rubbish on Twitter, you're not going to be able to sign a team.
Mm.
Let's talk about transfer windows, because this is something that it's a big talking point in non-league. It's not in the non-league game at the moment. There are reasons which we'll talk about why it's not in the non-league game. But let's start with, would you put a transfer window in? We've almost got to that point where we've had this discussion that actually it would be very beneficial.
I think like the point I would firstly like to make in non-league football, and potentially in football in general, is for me, I think there's eventually going to become a crisis with volunteers, and club secretaries are pretty much one of the most important people in a football club, and the amount of administration you have to do and the sort of sanctions or the consequences should you get a piece of administration wrong could be massive, and that's a big weight to put on someone's shoulders. So if there's any way of kind of putting a transfer window together or something to kind of condense that period to ease a bit of pressure from an admin side, I'd be all for it. And then if it helps kind of the competitive side of the game and you know, makes it a bit more of a contest because managers have to work within a certain time frame and opens up a contest in a league a bit more, then I think that's another really big positive as well.
As a manager, why wouldn't you want a transfer window?
Well, I think from a manager's point of view, why wouldn't you want that? Well, I think there's quite a few reasons why you wouldn't want that, because if you're going to be selfish and the players that you've signed during that transfer window are not the players that you thought they were going to be, or you're not getting the best out of them, then it's easy for a manager to then get rid of that player and bring someone else in. So from a purely selfish point of view, being a manager, if you're then stuck with the same squad of players and you're bottom of the league, and without self-reflection, blaming yourself, you're always going to be looking at other people to blame, and ultimately there's going to be the players. So that's one reason why you wouldn't want the transfer window. You know, the fact of the matter is, I don't think you should have a transfer window in non-league football unless everyone was put onto a contract, because it can't be fair for a player who's not on contract and is getting expenses or whatever, or agreed amount of money, to then be cast aside by the club and can't go and sign for anyone else. So it's just not fair on the player from that side of it as well.
You make a very good point on the player, which we'll come back to in a moment. I think the first point that you made, surely that would be down to bad recruitment by the manager. If that was the only 100%. Reason, and we weren't talking about the players and perhaps the fact that they're not on contracts means that they should be allowed to leave.
Well, you can look at that point as well, but then also, I mean, if you look at the case of Margate, so Margate have got, I think, probably 5, 6, maybe 7 influential players that are out at the moment injured. Some of them very, very long term. And if you're a club with very, very small resources and you can't then bring anyone else in, then you know you're going to be playing players that ultimately really aren't up to standard for the level they're at.
How would you work that as a? I'm trying to work through the reasons why you probably wouldn't have a transfer window in non-league. If you had 7 players out injured and you had to bring players in, are you just bringing them in on a short-term contract? Would that mean that then you could bring them in to replace a squad number and then bring them out again? And if you kept them, then you'd have too many players. So how would that work?
Well, you could start by saying that when you sign a player, he's signed on a contract. That could be the first port of call. If players were all under contract, then when you got players out, you'd obviously have to recruit players that are non-contract. So, like when I was Welling manager, I went in and we were governed by a transfer window, but you could still sign players that were out of contract outside that transfer window. So, for example, if Frank's got 20 players all under contract, I can't touch any of those players when I've got injury crisis at my club, but I could still find players from a lower level that were non-contract players or out of contract players, and I could still bring them in. The element of it I don't like is just you get a player doing well and Billericay won him, you've lost him, haven't you? Done. It's done. And clubs can just do that all year. So you're never ever gonna see a team develop a long-term strategy unless there's a huge amount of money involved and they've got all their players contracted. As long as there's no transfer window, every time a player does well, a club with more money can attract him and sign him, and the people that suffer are the people that recruited him in the first place.
In non-league, would it not be an answer then to perhaps have a series of transfer windows? You mentioned about the admin point of view being one of them with the volunteers, and we want some stability. We look at the Football League, and obviously up in the Premier League there's 2 windows in a season. Could there not be 4 or 5 windows in a season? But you would just get that little bit more stability where perhaps from August, September through to October, you couldn't bring players in. If you did get injuries, you had to get through a certain period, but you knew you'd only have to get through to October.
But we talk about youth development and people having youth structures in place, and every manager's quick to tell you how much they think how high they think of the youth structure. Well, if you do pick up injuries, then that's your opportunity to bring youth players into the side. I mean, look, what I believe in being as professional as you possibly can be. What is the example we see at the professional level? They have a transfer window. And I'm not saying one transfer window, but not 4 or 5. It's so short-termist. If you're building a team month to month, I just think to test managers and coaches and to basically regulate it so the big fish with all the money can't just do a really bad job, underachieve massively, and then just take the little fish's players overnight. I don't really like that element of it. And also, I think that players, when they sign for you, Jim said some players will leave for another £20. It would stop that, wouldn't it? It would stop that. Well, yeah, you can leave for another £20, but not until January.
Are there two types of managers? We touched on this a little bit last week. Are there managers, or are there two types of teams? One team that will perhaps be like your Billericay's, where you'll buy players and just keep bringing in players, better players, and then are there clubs that actually have coaches where the idea is that you'll develop players?
I mean, on the Margate point of view, like Jim said quite rightly, I mean, we've got a fantastic five-a-side team on the bench, or up in the stands watching at the moment, and it's tough, I think, for example, Alex Brown, one of the guys' bigger summer signings, someone they could invest in, has got an ACL injury out for summer. Kane Hainsman, it's a really challenging time when those kind of senior players, or those match winners in particular, aren't available to you. So although it's come from the board, an investment in youth, and it's linked to a far bigger, longer term picture, Mike and Steve have no other choice but to invest in youth, and they're coming up trumps, but it is a risk, and that is the thing we've kind of discussed in the past half hour, all those different things that you have to think about as a manager from week to week. But certainly at Margate so far, okay, we're not top of the league, we're not hitting all cylinders fine like potentially a Tunbridge Angels, but if you look at Tunbridge Angels, they're a supremely experienced side. When they came and played us, they had kind of a square almost of very experienced players that won the game for them. At Margate it's going to be a bit longer because we've got that investment in youth, and I think Steve Brown said it a couple of weeks ago, Margate will probably end the season stronger than they've started it, because these younger players are learning, and they're learning very, very quickly. But there's not a checkbook to dip into and sign a big name striker or a fantastic goalkeeper or defender or whatever. You've got to kind of, whatever your mantra is at the start of the season, you've got to stick to it when the money's not there.
I think that's all, you talk about, and it's a really good example about that. And Jody's quite right. He said it earlier about, I think sometimes managers can be a little bit lazy. The job of a manager is to coach people and bring the best out of them. We touched on Billericay, they can come in and buy a player. But even last year, Harry, fantastic coach, was flying, and yet they constantly were bringing in players all the time. And was there actually really a need for it? In my opinion, it probably wasn't Harry bringing them in, it was the chairman. But the fact of the matter is, there was no need for that to happen, constantly changing the side. But then the flip side of it, again, so we're talking about Margate, if you compare Margate to maybe someone else in the league that's got a really low budget, you've got those differences even there. So
if we were making the decision right now on the back of the net debate, would you bring a transfer window into non-league football?
A form of transfer window. It's not my job to decide exactly how it would run, but I think the movement of players needs to be regulated in some way.
Jim?
No.
Yeah.
I'm proper on the fence. Yeah, I think so.
3-1. So we'll put that in to bring in a transfer window. Might see it, you never know.
What about you, Ben?
I'll sit on the fence. Right, we're going to talk all about recruiting managers now, and what level of detail clubs go into. Again, in the Premier League, we see the level of which they recruit managers and the things that they think about. We're trying to get a picture of in non-league of how that recruitment works. We've actually seen an example of your successor being appointed at Haybridge, and Julian Dix was appointed last week, and some people saying that appointment will bring the club a lot of attention, an ex-professional. Is that the way that clubs might look at it? Would they look at things not just about the management? They may look at what the media side of it will bring to have a big name at the club?
I think undoubtedly clubs do that, because not Julian, I'm not talking about Julian, he has managed, but you often get ex-pros come in and manage, they've never managed, so you are just taking a punt You don't know anything about their managerial credentials, but you hire them probably because of the profile it will bring your football club. I mean, for example, Teddy Sheringham, when he got the Stevenage job, didn't have any sort of managerial track record, went in as a legend of the game, and had an absolute shocker and was gone by November, December. There's a lot of people out there fight really hard and work really hard in the game for a chance at a club like Stevenage, and they brought him in, and it had to be because of the profile. It can't have been because of his track record, because he didn't have one.
We see a lot of clubs now. We talk about social media, we talk about nutrition and coaching and recruitment. When it comes to a manager, a level of detail at a non-league club, how far do they go to sit down and actually put a short list out and go through, when they narrow it down to perhaps 3 or 4 candidates, how much detail does the club go into?
I guess it depends on the club, but I suppose the more professional, ambitious clubs will go into detail. Obviously, recruitment's been the theme of a lot of our conversation tonight, and we've spoken about how players know each other and the network of individuals. You know, the reason why I came down to Margate was because of the network of directors there and the people that I knew, and the fact that Kent football is a network, and it only takes a couple of conversations to find out, oh, actually, no, she's really good at this and he's really good at that. And I think, again, the values of a manager, as much as their coaching badges and qualifications, you know, I've worked under a lot of different managers now, and the most successful, they've all got the same level of qualifications, but the most successful have qualities about them that you're only ever going to know when you interview them and you get to know them well, and you see what they're like under pressure, or you see what they're like when things aren't going well for them. What are they like with the media? What are they like with the mascots you bring into the dressing room? So I think any club that wants to go places will make sure that they do all those thorough checks, will make sure that they like the person as much as the coach, but also at other areas of the football club, like that they've got the diversity right, that they've got a good blend of personalities, because ultimately that's what you're going to need to be a successful football club, in my opinion.
Is a manager's knowledge of players up there at the very top of the list at this level for key attributes that you need?
Jim?
Well, I'm probably the wrong person to be asking.
No, just from your experience.
I'm probably the wrong person to be asking that at the moment, because I'm going to say it should be, but it's not. So I've applied for 3 jobs since I resigned from the Met. So I'm 0 from 3. I've had the chairman of all 3 clubs speak to me or send me an email saying you came second. Well, I might as well come last, mightn't I? You know, and I appreciate them getting back to me. But, you know, all of those 3 jobs, barring maybe the first one, in my opinion, I was the best person to take that club on because of the contacts that I know, the time I've been involved in non-league football, the players I can bring in, the success I've had on low budgets, etc. So, yeah, I think, in my opinion, it should come down to, you know, what you know, who you know, how you go about it, and not just because your name.
I don't want you to obviously name the clubs, but do you feel, having seen the people that they've appointed, that it's not for those reasons, and perhaps it's for a different reason, to give the club something else? Again,
I think what Frank was saying earlier in relation to Tooting thing, it's hard for me to say because I wasn't there when they was interviewed. So I mean, I don't know what they've, you know, how they came across. I know that when I was interviewed, that I put a good case across for me to get the job. So the people that have got those jobs in front of me, obviously, and I wish them well, and I wish the club well. I mean, I'm not a vindictive person, and the reason why I didn't get the job is for the right reasons, because the chairman decided at the time I'm not the right person to do it. So it's the right reason for that club because the chairman's made that decision. So, you know, it's not really for me to say about, you know, what these other people have promised they can do or bring in. I would just like to think that is the reason why they got the job in front of me, rather than being who they are.
Do you, as a manager, do you think about your knowledge and your contacts with players as being one of the most important things that you need to perhaps demonstrate when you're trying to go for a job?
I think for me specifically, Ben, my managerial career is short-lived at the minute, because Tooting was my first senior job. So sort of sitting across from Jim, Jim's had 15 plus years of managerial experience, so he's been able to accumulate over time contacts and players and relationships with players and managers and everything else. Whereas for me, I started off with Tooting being my first senior job, so I had to sort of learn and adapt very, very quickly in terms of what the requirements were, and how important player recruitment was, and contacts and all the things and aspects of that we've discussed tonight. From my perspective, it was we won the London Cup and then we won the league in the second season, but we got relegated last season, and it's almost like having a black mark on your credit file in some ways, because you've if you've been relegated, it might give a perception that you might just not be up to the task at that level of football. I don't feel that way personally, but I think that weighing up my success so far in a very short space of time, and I don't mean to say that to champion myself at all, but I'm only sort of 3 years old in terms of a football manager, and already I've had a promotion and a relegation, and I'm sure that those are the sort of things that get weighed up for me personally when I apply for jobs at the moment. Whether or not I end up being successful at one, I don't know, and I personally don't know what route to take at the moment in terms of where to go, which club to pitch myself to based on my success or lack of success so far as a manager. It's definitely not defined for me in terms of what the probability or what the outcome might be if I go for this job as opposed to the next job. It's a case of, like a job application, just put yourself forward and hopefully get a chance to sit down with someone and have a chat.
It's not just in your circumstance. When you mentioned you've been promoted and relegated, and I sort of looking to Jody and Jim here and asking that, is it not that we talk about recruitment of managers and their CVs, if someone's actually been through a relegation, although like you said, Frank, nobody would want it to actually have that happen to them, the experience that you'd get from that is something that you could look at and say, well, you've been through something. You might have got relegated, but you've actually been through and managed a team that were in a difficult situation all year.
Well, my greatest experience as a manager was going in at Welling, barely winning a game and getting sacked fairly quickly after 3 months. It hurt me, and it's hard mentally to take that, especially when you haven't had any failures like that. But I know, reflecting on my career, it was the biggest learning curve. It changed me as a manager. It changed my approach to a lot of things, and I picked up skills in there that have become invaluable to me, and then allowed me to go in at Heybridge in a relegation battle, having struggled at Welling, to go in at a relegation battle and have the skills to turn it around. So your relegation battle, I think that's a good thing to have on your CV. I know that sounds a little bit strange, but in 5 years' time, when you're managing another club and you've had some good times, but now you're having difficult times, you'll call back on the experiences from that relegation battle, and it holds you in good stead.
We talk about experience there, experience at this level. I think one of the leagues that you look at in the professional game that we always hear that word experience is perhaps the Championship, where people say that this particular league is one that you need that experience to get out of and into the Premier League. It's the most difficult. When you look at the leagues, perhaps the National League and the Bostik Premier Division, those levels where you actually take that step up, can the same thing be said? Is it really about experience, or does it not really matter at that level of football?
Sorry, I was going to say the one quality I would say any football manager needs at whatever level is resilience. And like you were saying at your period of Welling in yourself, like if you don't have that quality, it doesn't really matter what else. So that was only going to be my one key point. Sorry to.
I've forgotten what I was going to say.
Sorry.
I actually have.
I don't think it. They always say that it's the hardest league to get out of. I think every league is the hardest league to get out of. Jody picks up on his point, like there's only going to be one winner of the league, so only one manager is going to be successful in. I was just going to
say, Jim, the Championship, I'm a Reading fan, it's definitely the hardest league to get out of.
Yeah, well,
I'm a Fulham fan, Ben, so
and you got
to change the conversation. Sorry, Jim, back to you.
Yeah, and I just think that every league is difficult to get out of. If you've got an experienced manager, I do feel that you've got a better chance of doing well, in my opinion. But then you could balance that off with the new innovative managers. For instance, Danny Cowley. In my opinion, even his success so far at Lincoln, he should be spoken about for certainly Championship jobs. Aston Villa, why not? Aston Villa, a massive club. He's full of innovative ideas. Yes, he's experienced in non-league. limited experience in the pro game, but he's ready, in my opinion, to step up and go even higher.
There's an example actually of experience not working in the Championship with Steve Bruce.
Well, what were the teams that got promoted out of the Championship this year into the Premier League?
Frank will be in the best position to say. Well,
Fulham.
certainly Fulham.
Fulham, Brighton.
Jokanovic not experienced, is he, at Championship level?
Well, he got Wolves. He got Wolves or Watford. Can't remember which one it was. Promoted from the
I
Championship.
thought that was Zola, wasn't it?
No, it was.
Oh, was it?
It was him, and then
Wolves got promoted as well. New manager to the Championship.
He was manager there. They got promoted, and then they sacked him. Fulham haven't started very well this season. So whether or not the chairman of the club will look at someone else with more a track record about in the Premier League elite specifically, who's got experience, who can come in and sort of take charge of the football club and sustain it at this level, because track record says successful in the league below and gaining a promotion, but do we, as in chairman or clubs, do we think of the next level being sustainability at the elite level or the league above, being someone that has had that experience already, not someone that was just successful at the level below, but someone that was unsuccessful at winning something but sustained it at that level.
But how do you actually manage? How do you judge success from a manager? So, for instance, I had one of the bottom 4 budgets in the Bostik Premier, and yet we got 5th. We came 5th one year. We came top 10, I think, in 4 of the last 7 years or whatever. In my opinion, I think that's very successful. There's other managers that I know that have had huge budgets that have finished below me, and then the next season they may have made the playoffs, and then they're lauded because and yet is that success? They've had a huge budget every week. We as managers know what other clubs' budgets are because we talk amongst each other, the managers. So we know how much, for instance, other clubs are on, and we can gauge our opinion it's how successful they've been throughout that season by their budgets as well.
Charlotte, your club in the summer where you had a change of management, did you, to Jim's point, did you sit down and say, well, this is what success will look like, and did you then tell that to the management team, this is what we expect from you, our expectations?
I guess we had a bit of an unusual one in that Steve and Mike were both involved in the football club from the season before, so I think there were levels of expectation last season that they just wanted to bring stability to the football club, I think, after the previous ownership, the relegation. But ultimately, I think there was a disappointment that we didn't make the playoffs as a minimum, whereas this year the guys are working with a smaller budget, which is known. There's more investment kind of going into the youth and bringing those players through. So I guess the expectation in that sense is, a playoff place, hopefully. But it's interesting kind of talking about the experience and how do you quantify and how do you value experience, because we've got a management duo which I actually think works quite well. You've got Steve Brown, who is a Charlton legend, has played at Wembley in a playoff final, mixed with Mike Salmon, who you guys had on the show a couple of months ago, 30 years old, but has got tons of experience from academy level to non-league, and that blend suits our football club. It's suits our vision of where we want to go, and actually those qualities, it's getting that on and off the pitch right, which is potentially more important than necessarily telling someone we expect you to be in this league position. It's, are we achieving these things? Are we getting the integration within our youth setup? Are the guys helping us get bigger crowds each week? It's much more of a team effort sometimes than just the management, and that's certainly how I feel. I'll work Monday to Saturday 3 p.m. to do my best for the football club to win 3 points. I have absolutely no influence on tactics or players or anything like that, but I still feel like we have a role as a team which goes beyond the dugout.
That's brilliant to hear.
You mentioned the word expectation there, and obviously it's refreshing to hear that it's a little bit different at Margate, and that's the team values and the things that you want to achieve. The last point that I want to make tonight is about that word expectation, and actually about the pressure that's put on by the clubs. It was something that we touched on earlier in the show. The pressure that's on managers now. You mentioned that there's managers that have lost their jobs already in non-league, and that it's actually spiralling down. We touched on Steve Bruce as well. That's now it's just seen as the normal in the Championship and the Premier League, but in non-league perhaps it wasn't normal, and it's becoming that way. Is there too much pressure in the game as a whole? Is that just the way football's going?
I think probably us three were jumping at the bit maybe to jump in there and maybe discuss and sort of give our own personal views on our own sort of situations where we might have felt under pressure or anything like that. I'll sort of sort of be honest and upfront about my experience at Tooting last season. I think the first mistake I made when we got promoted was publicly and sort of endorsing the chairman's thoughts about finishing in the playoffs last season. I think as a young manager, you get a bit, and I did get a bit carried away with the fact that, you know, we sort of got record points for the league, for the club, and that sort of stuff. Got promoted. Yes, we had an extremely low budget, Jim, probably lower than yours, I'd say. Yeah. But the chairman endorsed the fact that maybe again carried away with the sentiment of promotion. You know, we should. You know, he sort of put the stamp down. You know, we want the playoffs, and I think I felt as a manager to endorse that on his behalf, because first of all, I didn't want to go against the chairman. I didn't want to sort of not echo his sentiments and thoughts, and I just felt that was a pressure that I probably put on myself. And maybe what I should have done in hindsight is be more sensible and actually say to the chairman, oh, hang on a minute, with a very, very low budget, only just getting promoted last season and coming back into step 3, I think our sort of expectations should be miles more realistic. But I think experience would have told me that had I been managing for 5-10 years already, probably would have known to sort of feel that way. So I definitely felt the pressure last season in terms of what the expectation was that was put upon me and the players.
We could talk so much more about this subject. I'm sure we're going to revisit it on the debate in future weeks, the role of a manager perhaps, and the pressures that lie within that role. We've run out of time to talk any more tonight. Don't forget you can get your thoughts into his official BOTN on social media, and you can join in the debate for the rest of the week. Before we go, though, Jody, I do just want to have a look at the non-league paper. We're going to take a look at some of the headlines in there in weeks to come. One of the things in there this week is the headline, Boss Hits Back in Brown Row, and this row that you've become embroiled in with the league. We talked about it last week. I'm just going to pick out a couple of bits here that has been said in the paper, and it's really where Nick Robinson, who's the chairman of the Bostik Leagues, is questioning your comments and saying that you've isolated yourself by branding the league unprofessional. It says in here that we're disappointed at the allegations he's made, particularly about the board, because your vice chairman at Haybridge, Michael Gibson, was on it last year. There's some quite damning accusations in here, and it'd be interesting to get your thoughts on it.
A lot of inaccuracies in what he says. I'm really, really surprised at a person that is given the responsibility to chair an entire league. I've also been told that he's a lawyer by trade, so I'm surprised that he's decided to attack me and fairly persistently now, 2 statements in a week, try and defame my character. He keeps bringing up my discipline. I think my disciplinary record stands up against most managers that have had a long career, like in 600-700 games. I think I've been sent from the dugout 6 or 7 times for dissent. I don't think that's bad. Spent a huge number of years in professional football, never ever had my conduct brought into question. But Nick Robinson, the chairman of the league, because I've questioned the professionalism of the league, he's felt that instead of sitting down and talking to me and asking me what's made me come out with these comments, what's made me step down from a role, what external factors have got me that down, that I've decided to walk away from a successful position, he's decided to go on the attack. So in essence, he's just highlighting his unprofessionalism.
I want to just pick out 2 parts of this. The first thing it says, I think that you've isolated yourself from the league by your comments.
I've criticised the governing body, various elements of the professionalism. I've questioned their integrity. Let's remember the reason I questioned their integrity, because the senior chairman of Averley Football Club followed me into a car park and told me that the vice chairman of the league has hated me for 8 years. Before that point, I never questioned the league's integrity. I think I'm well within my rights to think, oh, maybe those decisions that have gone against me over the years were because the vice chairman of the league hates me. I don't think Craig Johnson's made a statement anywhere as yet. Maybe he could come out and say, oh, I don't hate Jody and I don't know where this came from. But he stayed tight-lipped. You know, everyone's been forced not to tell my story. So Nick Robinson's calling everyone and saying, don't let Jody speak. Nothing can go out. Papers, that Ismian podcast show. You've probably had it as well. But he's very quick to to basically, it's strong. He's defaming my character. He's saying that I've got some sort of disciplinary issue. Let's just remember, I've not been charged with anything. I've not done anything wrong. I felt so run down with some of the experiences I was getting in his league that I decided to step down. My chairman begged me and pleaded me to stay, offered me a 2-year contract, offered me more money, and I walked away from it. I think Nick Robinson, if he was a professional man, the first thing he would have done, or anyone at that league, would have called me, emailed me, contacted me and said, let's have a meeting, let's discuss these issues, see if we can get to the bottom of it, have some sort of investigation, and then pass judgment on me. He's in there, he's saying that I'm just lying. But we know, and sorry to go on, we know there's video footage that shows and illustrates every single thing that I've said. So I've had one email from the league. They've demanded that I retract the statement. Well, I'm never going to retract it because I spoke from the heart. I spoke truthfully, so my story will never change. And I've had a lot of support. So it's easy for him to say in there, the 81 clubs are, all very supportive of us, and we've been inundated with emails. I'd like to see these emails because I've had a lot of club owners, club managers, club chairmen, players contact me and say, we completely support your comments. We're just not willing to say them in public because obviously we want to be part of the Bostik League, which I completely understand. I don't think I would have been isolated from the Bostik League if it wasn't for Nick Robinson's comments.
We certainly wish you all the best with a resolution with it and hope that there is one and it comes quickly. It was an article that was in this week's non-league paper. We'll be looking in future weeks at the non-league paper and some of the headlines in there, and we certainly will on this show, on The Debate, talk about absolutely anything and everything across the non-league game. All that remains is to thank everybody for joining us on The Debate tonight. Don't forget, as we said, you can get involved in the debate all week on official BOTN, and we'll be back with another non-league debate next week.
Have your say. Get in touch on social media. Just search official BOTN.